Good evening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, everyone. Hope you're well. This next video with our friend, our scholar, our Sheikh Imam Maturidi. In this video, what I want to do is trace the genealogy of Imam Maturidi's theology. So, what was the intellectual environment in which Imam Maturidi was engaged with in the world in which he fought? Um, Now, there's a really good passage which our author captures the world that he inherited, and I think this is really, really useful for us living in 21st century in Britain or wherever else we may be, thinking about how we should engage with various types of knowledge. Okay, and this is the word of someone called Gustav von Grombon, who's an academic, and he has a book. The title of the book is The Sources of Islamic Civilization. A wonderful book, by the way. I really recommend people read that book, The Sources of Islamic Civilization. And this is a passage from page 15 of his book. And I'm going to read the entire passage out for you. More fully developed edifices of thought erected with the help of a logical technique of extraordinary subtlety, rational science, a larger and more varied accumulation of texts to serve as authoritative basis for deductive reasoning, a wider range of admissible and assimilated experience, and quite generally a higher level of training and sophistication. This is the world Muslims inherited and were engaged with. I'm going to continue. This sophistication was manifest not least in acute awareness of the implications and problems of a given philosophical or religious position. And it may be argued that the foremost effect of the plunge into the milieu of ancient Hellenization was a rise in self consciousness regarding the meaning of the Muslim postulates and an inner compulsion of increasing force to think through, articulate, and harmonize the accepted religious data. In other words, Muslims were taking in all forms of ideas from all parts of the world, even if they weren't quote unquote Islamic. Right nowadays, we are ever obsessed with Islamization or Islamicizing things, halalifying things, right? And this is Imam Maturidi's milieu, the world that he lived in, that Muslims were not afraid to take even Greek ideas, Hellenistic ideas, and engage with them as well. So Imam Maturidi's theological system, like similar to others in the early centuries of Islam, can be understood as emerging from this encounter, right? So this was a new synthesis, and so he simultaneously drew on several main sources, many sources he drew from simultaneously, right? Unlike us today, who only say, "Oh, we only want from one source," he was willing to derive from many sources of knowledge. This was a confidence that these people had. What were they? The incipient local Samarkandi Hanafi Kalam tradition. This was the Hanafi Kalam tradition in Samarkand. Intra-Muslim debate with the Baghdadi Mu'tazili. Intra-religious polemic with Zoroastrian, Christian, Buddhist, and other disputants in Transaxonia, and a growing corpus of Arabic Hellenistic or Hellenic philosophy. These were all the worldviews these people were engaging with. So, like Hanafism, right, the roots of the Mu'tazilat go back to the second, or if you like, the 8th century, and the famous Baghdadi and Basran schools traditions were consolidated, as you know, in the 3rd or 9th century. During this century, there was an organic link with a tradition associated with the Kufa scholar Imam Abu Hanifa, especially in Iraq, by which many Mu'tazilite theologians adopted the Nascent Judist school, and Hanafi Jurists adopted Mu'tazilite theology. This is a whole discussion that I'm not going to go into today. And there's a contrast because Hanafism obviously emerged if you compare this with the Transox Hanafi tradition, right? Which for the most part, branched off, if you like, directly from its Kufan founding fathers and developed for the most part outside of the purview of Mu'tazilite thinking in Balkh and Samarkand. So by the time of or the life of Imam Maturidi, the views of especially the Baghdadi Mu'tazilites had already filtered into Transoxania through outposts such as Rai in Persia, right? And so, Imam Maturidi, you'll find has an open mind to the rich Mu'tazilite tradition within his own theological writing. And some people might find this controversial, but you'll find this in the writings of Imam Maturidi as well. Okay, yes, that's what you do. If you're Hanafi, you generally follow the Maturidi worldview. Okay, so the Hanafi Kalam, the Hanafi theology, just to answer your question, from which Imam Maturidi thought emerged, did not focus on the nature of God's attributes, which was usually a central concern for Muslim theologians in his time. Instead, the Hanafis continued, if you read their works, to highlight faith, its relation to action, and its implication for community membership, to be part of the Ummah. What does it mean when you're a believer? Questions that were central to the origins of the theological dispute that emerged in the 1st or 7th century as well. And so this can be explained in particular by the activities of Imam Abu Hanifa. And there's a famous letter that he wrote to a Basran contemporary, someone who lived in the same time, Uthman al-Batti. And if you read that, it centers on these sort of questions, right? As does the dialogue recorded between him and his student Abu Muqatil al-Samarqandi. And this kitab is called Kitab al-Alim wal-Muta'allim, right? And so you'll find a lot of these discussions, material relating to theology of divine attributes. Okay. So I want to make this point very, very clear. Okay. Now, the other thing which should be clear now with our journey in these few videos is that Imam Maturidi engaged with non-Islamic sources and ideas as well, such as Zoroastrianism, Christianity, Buddhism. And this is quite significant, although it wasn't comprehensive as well. And so he, in his book that I mentioned last time, his Kitab al-Tawheed, he was content within the book of Kitab al-Tawheed to attack what he saw some of the most egregious theological errors, and he was mainly interested in articulating the Islamic doctrine, okay, rather than present them on their own terms as well. And so the value of citing these foreign teachings was to support the argument. So when he engaged with these ideas which weren't Islamic, they were used or they were deployed to support arguments that Imam Maturidi wished to make about the veracity of Islamic teachings on selective topics as well. Nevertheless, naturalized philosophical ideas from these sources are significant in the conceptual formulations of the Kalam tradition to which Imam Maturidi is indebted. So he was very, very comfortable taking these ideas as well. Okay, stick to books written by our scholars. Don't get involved in theology. This is just a question someone's asked. Don't get involved in Kalam when you haven't read the basics. You have to, it's like anything in life. I always say to people, if you're going to a location, you want to go somewhere, before you even leave, you need to know where you are, right? You need to know where you stand. So there's no point in reading things that are not relevant to you and not going to benefit you when you don't even know your own theological positions, right? So focus on what's important for you. Learn from scholars, learn from people who know what they're talking about, and later on you can get involved in different aspects of other theological traditions. So I wouldn't get involved in these sort of things. Okay. Books written by our tradition, right? Learn, if you really want to get into Kalam, as the name tells you, Kalam, to do theology, language, you need to learn the Arabic language, because a lot of discussions when it comes to theology pertain to familiarization of the Kalam of Allah, the books of Allah, the language that Allah has revealed the book in, and the early Muslim community uses as well. Otherwise, you'll just struggle. Translations will never do justice. Anyway, going back to the book. So Muslim theologians were not then reinventing the wheel, but applying rational techniques that were already well adapted to previous revelations that shared the same basic conceptual presuppositions. So they weren't reinventing. Muslims weren't reinventing things. This is a misunderstanding. They were happy to borrow from other people, other traditions, other civilizations, and whatever was useful, they used it. Whatever wasn't useful to them, they didn't use it as well. To a certain extent, for example, the Hellenic, the Greek tradition, and other existing modes of thought entered Muslim theology. When converts, for example, would come to Islam thinking on the data of revelation in the best way they knew how. So when these new Muslims or these converts came to Islam, they had already learned certain ways of knowing the world, and they were bringing that into Islam. And those ideas were actually contributing to the richness of the intellectual, Islamic intellectual tradition, right? So Muslims were comfortable with these things. And when people who were converting to Islam, whether they were Zoroastrians, Buddhists, Christians, they were bringing their tradition in, and that was adding to the richness of Muslims making sense of the world as well. And you see this, I mean, in places like in Kufa or Basra in Iraq, right? Even at the dawn of the Abbasid era in the 2nd, 8th century, in the new capital of Baghdad, right? That there was a translation movement of Greek philosophical texts into Arabic, right? And sometimes this was through the intermediary of Syriac. So Muslims were really engaging with these ideas as well. So Imam Maturidi was engaging with the Hellenic philosophy because that was the philosophy of his time, of his as well. And in his Kitab al-Tawheed, you'll find that he quotes Aristotle by the name of Aristoteles, right? And so this is the context is important in determining his reception of the philosopher, right? It's a refutation of the position of the materialists and that the world is eternal. So he's using his ideas to refute people who believe in things that are not part of our tradition, but he's using scholars, he's using ideas not purely Islamic as well. So Imam Maturidi, for example, in his book, he states that a certain group claim that the raw materials, the tina of the world, is eternal prime matter, hayula, which is devoid of any accidental qualities such as length, weight, heat, or movement. Then what he then does is he basically uses Aristotle's 10 categories, right? And he brings them in, Imam Maturidi. And this is not responding to a worldview, right? And this is his obviously this Imam Maturidi is referencing here, or he's relating what Aristotle's famous book, the Organon, right, which contained what's called the categories, and it was one of the earliest books that was translated into Arabic in the mid 2nd, 8th century by someone called Ibn al-Muqaffa, or probably by his son as well. So Imam Maturidi appears to refer approvingly to the 10 categories that categories that Aristotle is providing, right? He says no one is able to mention anything out of them. So he's refuting the materialist, the Dahriya, using Aristotle, right? And he's not anyway uncomfortable about it, right? So this is something to bear in mind. The point I'm making is Imam Maturidi was using everything at his disposal to bring out a theology that was Islamic, right? But was borrowing from different ideas as well. And so even, besides mentioning Aristotelian philosophical methods, Imam Maturidi draws from the early Kalam approach to logic that emphasizes dialectic in line with what's called the Stoic tradition as well. So other traditions were fine with him as well. So the strength of Imam Maturidi's thought is his ability to fashion existing Hanafi Kalam with other philosophical and theological material into a new paradigm as well. Okay, so I mean his synthesis of reasoning derives from Aristotelian Neoplatonic tradition. Right? Even in the madrasa, many of the texts that we study to do with logic, these are not Islamic themselves. They've been taken from other traditions as well. So normatively speaking, the author says this pedigree is not a shameful secret. You shouldn't be ashamed that Muslims did this, or you shouldn't feel like this is some sort of alien intrusion within the so-called pristine purity of Islamic revelation, but indicative of the perennial viability for philosophical theology to provide systematic articulation of scriptural truths. Subhanallah. That other people may have worldviews, may have written things that we may not agree with 100%, but there may be things that we can find useful for ourselves. So Imam Maturidi's achievement lies in harvesting a new tradition from these seeds, one able to rationally justify itself against rivals within its milieu, including those with a shared history. And so the acceptability of his school as a recognizable expression of Sunni Islam comes not just from its Hanafi origins and certain distinctive doctrines, but from its meaning, coherence, and openness to the best thinking of its age. And I think really important that Muslims, Imam Maturidi in particular, who many of us follow in our theological persuasions, was open to the best of thinking of his time, best ideas, right? And that's really important. So These should be the criteria, the author says, for any contemporary Islamic theology, right? This is the way it should be. You should be open and taking ideas from the best of what's out there, right? And this is in line with the tradition of the Prophet, peace be upon him, that the believer takes, the wisdom, right, which is a treasure uh, of a believer. So that's something that we should do. But what would happen after Imam Maturidi? Right? So this was Imam Maturidi we talked about in this video and the previous video. But what of Imam Maturidi after him? What about people that followed his tradition? Where does that fit into the story? And in the next video, I'm going to do that if God wills. All right, stay safe, inshallah. It's a shorter video this time, and we'll have a longer video when we need to. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.